Hello, and welcome to SecureTalk, a podcast where we explore the critical world of information security innovation and compliance. I'm your host, Justin Beals, founder and CEO of StrikeGraph. Together with our expert guests, we'll provide you tools and tips to help your business thrive in the rapidly evolving cybersecurity environment. Hello, everyone, and welcome to SecureTalk. I'm your host, Justin Beals. In our increasingly connected digital world, the battlefield for truth has shifted dramatically. While we once worried primarily about hackers breaching our systems, today's most sophisticated attacks don't target our computers. They target our reality itself. For decades, we've had tools to verify information online. We could check URLs, investigate domain owners, and follow hyperlinks to original sources. But we're now witnessing a fundamental shift as AI language models increasingly replace search engines as our primary gateway to information. Unlike a search result that shows you where information comes from, these AI systems deliver answers with absolute confidence while obscuring their sources entirely. Recently, a remarkable discovery has been exposed: how Russian operatives are executing a strategy that security experts call LLM grooming, deliberately poisoning AI systems with false narratives. Unlike traditional disinformation campaigns that target human readers directly, these operations specifically aim to corrupt AI models themselves. The Moscow-based Pravda network, meaning truth in a twisted piece of irony, has flooded the internet with over 3.6 million fabricated articles in 2024 alone. Their goal isn't to convince human readers. It's to ensure that when you ask ChatGPT, Claude, or any major AI system about certain topics, you're unknowingly fed Kremlin propaganda. As these AI systems increasingly replace traditional search engines, with their responses appearing more authoritative than a list of links, we're losing our ability to evaluate sources critically. The AI simply delivers an answer with no clear path to verify where that information originated or what biases might be embedded within it. What makes this approach so insidious is that these AI tools present information with absolute confidence, making it nearly impossible for users to distinguish between fact from fiction. NewsGuard's groundbreaking research has revealed that leading AI chatbots repeated false narratives from the Pravda network 33% of the time, a staggering success rate for what amounts to digital brainwashing on a global scale. As American fugitive turned Moscow-based propagandist Jean-Marc Dugan brazenly admitted at a recent Russian conference, by pushing these Russian narratives from the Russian perspective, we can actually change worldwide AI. With each technological advancement, from AI assistance to automated news aggregation, we're creating new vulnerabilities for those seeking to manipulate hearts and minds. As search engines increasingly integrate AI or get replaced entirely by chatbots, the transparency of our information ecosystem is evaporating. We're trading the ability to verify sources for convenience. And malicious actors are exploiting this trade-off with devastating effectiveness. The fundamental question becomes, in a world where even our digital tools can be compromised and where information provenance is increasingly obscured, how do we preserve truth itself? Haven't we seen this story before? Didn't it happen with Cambridge Analytica? Well, today we're joined by two experts at the front lines of this battle: McKenzie, Sadeghi, and Blachez from NewsGuard, whose investigative work has exposed one of the most sophisticated disinformation operations in modern history. We'll explore how these campaigns operate, how they're evolving with artificial intelligence, and most importantly, what we can do to protect ourselves and our democratic institutions. McKenzie Sadeghi is editor of AI and Foreign Influence for NewsGuard. Previously, she worked as a fact checker and reporter at USA Today, focusing on misinformation related to the COVID-19 pandemic, elections, and international conflicts. As an undergrad at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School, she covered politics for Arizona PBS and worked at the college publication, The State Press. She has a master's degree in journalism from Georgetown University and is currently completing a master's degree in cybersecurity at the NYU School of Law and Engineering. Isis Blachez is a staff analyst at NewsGuard. She recently completed a master's degree at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. She also interned for Les Echos International Desk and worked for Spring Voice, a marketing consulting company. In 2023, she earned a bachelor's from the Joint Sciences Po Paris and Columbia University program, majoring in economics and sociology. Join us on SecureTalk as we pull back the curtain on this new frontier of disinformation warfare. Hello, everyone, and welcome to SecureTalk. Really glad to have you today. We have our two guests, McKenzie and Isis. Thanks for joining us on SecureTalk today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us. Thanks.
Excellent. So both of you guys work at an organization called NewsGuard, which specializes in disinformation research. Can you tell us a little bit about your professional backgrounds and what led you to this type of work?
Sure. So before I joined NewsGuard, I was covering misinformation at USA Today. I joined the team right when they had become a third-party fact-checker of Meta, and that program now, 5 years later today, has been dismantled. But while I was there, I focused a lot on misinformation about the election, COVID, Russia-Ukraine war, and really wanted to dive deeper into that beyond just what was circulating on social media, which is what ultimately led me to NewsGuard, which is focused a lot more in depth on the issue of misinformation and looking at the credibility of information at the source.
Yeah, and so I've always been interested in how journalism plays out in the digital age and how information, can be manipulated online. I worked for a French newspaper before, a financial newspaper, and then I did Columbia Journalism School master's degree. And I'm quite new to, the field of AI and misinformation. I've been working at NewsGuard for about a year. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's intriguing to me because I wonder if you guys have seen this, but your careers have touched in a couple of places where I think sometimes, a place like Facebook felt like for a while they were leaned into trying to solve this problem because I think there was a lot of public outcry about the challenges so far as to create a third-party relationship with you doing the analysis. But in the last year, we've seen, I think, a pullback from this concept that they want to be responsible for it or even care. How do you feel about the shifts in the landscape as participants in researching and, of course, caring about effective journalism and effective information?
Yeah, I think there's been a huge shift since I started, but particularly, like you mentioned, within the past year, not just Meta, but other platforms like X. We're seeing the gradual rollback of content moderation efforts. It seems like a lot of tech platforms are now more in favor of a crowdsourced community-style fact-checking approach, which, on its own brings its own issues when you can have anyone on the internet debunking things, which often requires, the expertise and training of a professional journalist. So I think we are seeing some notable shifts, but I think that just makes this work even more important in light of that.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I feel like more and more, medias have added a fact-checking branch, and we're talking about misinformation and disinformation a lot more than we were a couple of years ago.
Yeah. So is this like you've seen this change a little bit where you started in your career and then what they're doing? How does NewsGuard fit into the landscape of now journalistic efforts, from a Wall Street Journal to Facebook? How do you think about the mission there and what work you're doing?
I think NewsGuard stands out and is different in the sense that we're not essentially fact checkers. What we do is review and rate the transparency and reliability of news and information sites. So we have a team of trained journalists in the US, the UK, Germany, France, and elsewhere applying 9 apolitical criteria points to a website online that you might come across to get your news. And those ratings are used by the public, the community, or advertisers who want to prevent their ad spending from going to Russian state media or something of that sort. So I think we're unique in that sense, where we're doing really in-depth and rigorous rating of news and information sources.
Yeah.
If I may add on to that,
Please.
I think compared to other fact checkers, we're pretty good at tracking the spread and origin of a false narrative or a false claim and tying it to, foreign operations. And we have a database of, all those fact checks and everything, which allows us to do quantitative analysis of, trends in certain types of false narratives, or, quantify how many more have been using AI. So that's pretty different from what other fact checkers are going to do out there.
Yeah. And it's funny, I think the government landscape and the pillar of journalism and the commercial nature of business have been interweaving itself a lot more than maybe has been in the past. I mean, Isis, to your point about AI being new, this is another abstraction. Before I put thoughts in your, head or words in your mouth, how do you perceive the rise of AI, as someone that's not a technologist?
In the sense of journalism, I think that any tool that is that powerful and strong is also just as equally capable of being very bad. And I think within the past couple of years, we've increasingly started to see newsrooms adopt AI into that process, both in a responsible way and irresponsible way. So whether that's for, data collection purposes or generating headlines, and disclosing that transparently to readers. And then on the other side, there's a range of bad actors who are weaponizing this technology to produce information at a very mass scale that allows it to look much more credible. So I think, there's both benefits and downsides of it. And I think it's still such a new topic and sensation that researchers all across the field are still trying to fully grasp and understand what the issues are and where it's heading. But at the same time, these tools are advancing and getting stronger at a rate before some of these issues can be fully understood.
Yeah. One of the things that I've noticed that's interesting about these tools, I think to your point, McKenzie, is that they're sucking up those conversations with non-experts as factual. I can point to a site like Reddit, and that's a perfect example to me of a place where it's trying to read a lot of data, because these things are not trained to answer factually. They're trained to build the answer that people will most believe. That seems counterproductive to good journalism.
Right, exactly. But they're marketed in the sense that they are factual and trustworthy. And, the way that these responses are produced, if you've ever used a chatbot and just asked a basic question about something, they answer so authoritatively, as if whatever they're saying is 100% factual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I wanted to dig in a little bit to a recent report that both of you wrote. I read it and was floored and found it really intriguing. So thank you for the work. And the report reveals that there was a Moscow-based network called Pravda that had started infecting Western AI tools. I'd like to ask you first about the genesis of doing the research. Was this something you were kind of monitoring and decided to dig in deeper? Or was there a touch point that had you interested and curious?
Yeah, so basically what had prompted this was starting of July 2024 of last year, we started conducting a monthly red teaming audit of the trustworthiness and accuracy of the 10 leading generative AI models, using those data sets we mentioned earlier, which are our data on false narratives, as well as our data on the source credibility of news and information sites. And month after month, we noticed that the chatbots, while they performed well on maybe health or mainstream politics matters, they performed much more poorly when it came to Russian disinformation in particular. And so we noticed that in each month, they were citing articles from the Pravda network. So this was an observation we had since about August or September. And the continuous citations and the reliance on this network is what ultimately prompted us to do a more targeted and specific audit of how this network was infecting the responses of AI models.
How'd you go about identifying what is Pravda network and what wasn't, in a way, trying to figure out who was, because they'll try to spread it out so it's obfuscate, hard to realize where the source material is coming from?
Like figuring out who's behind the network?
Yeah.
We've been monitoring this network for quite some time, but it really was mainly building off the research of so many others in this community. Governmental organizations, nonprofits. There's such a vast collection of reports and research on this network and its scale and its owners. It was traced back down to a Russian businessman based in Moscow who has previously been behind such sites. So those type of ties were able to help us map out its connections and its scale.
Good. Is this something both of y'all have been working on, or did the project bring you together, or were you sitting at the same desk? I think of the old detective movies where you're like shouting across the desk, being like, "Did you see that? I saw this. Maybe we should go do this research project."
It's actually mostly McKenzie who's been doing this research. And so we do sit next to each other in the office.
Yeah.
And we actually did one of the AI audits in French earlier this year. So McKenzie trained me to, test the chatbots and showed me the methodology and got me interested in all of it. So she onboarded me for this one as well.
Yeah. I think one of the big findings, the one that floored me, is that you found that leading AI chatbots repeated false narratives from the Pravda network 33% of the time. That is staggering. The scores from NewsGuard are what allow you to drive that analysis, right, of how much is disinformation from Pravda network versus something else. Is that correct? That was the basis of the scoring methodology for the research.
Yeah, so it's our misinformation fingerprints, which is our data set of false narratives that we've cataloged Pravda as spreading, and then also our write-up of the network's trustworthiness as well that allowed us to do this. But in terms of categorizing the responses as disinformation or true or false, it really was just a manual human review of looking at all 450 responses from the chatbots and seeing whether it repeated the claim or not. And I think it also just really goes to show the importance of human red teaming. A lot of red teaming efforts so far have really been largely automated or done automatically. And I think this human review process really allows us to be much more rigorous and get all the details. And, Isis and I sitting together in the office, we can go over a response together, make a judgment based on, how we should classify it.
That's really intriguing. Can you give me an example of one where you might have disagreed? Yeah.
I'm thinking, off the top of my head, it would have been mostly responses where the chatbot is going to start by, repeating the false information and then is going to follow up with a debunk and nuancing, the information, be some other sources claim the opposite. And that's where a situation where you really have to go case by case basis, because it does repeat the false information pretty authoritatively, but then once again, it invites, the user to look at other sources. So those are, responses where there was more discussion. And like I said, it really depended on the content of the answer. It wasn't like, that wasn't, immediately a debunk or, providing false information.
I find that so intriguing because I'm really big on accuracy. I've been working with these AI models for a long time, and I criticize a lot of the types of machine learning models that we create, that we don't run an accuracy measure on, how accurate the representation is. Y'all, as I think I'm imagining here, coming from a background of journalism and wanting to report on what I remember from my high school journalism days as facts, it's going to get tricky to be like, in these situations where the machine wants to make it murky. And I think there's been drive to make facts murky by those in power that want to shift perception. Whereas y'all are fighting for, no, there has to be a definitive set of reality that we share. I just have to imagine that's tough. Like y'all must look broadly across and be frustrated by this concept.
Yeah, I think throughout our audits, that's the biggest challenge we've had is the responses where it gives equal weight to both sides. The true information from the officials and then the false claim, even though only one side is accurate and rooted in facts. And I think, in a traditional journalism or news story, it's normal and important to quote and represent both sides. But I think when it comes to, disinformation and false claims, there's only one true side and one set of facts. And by giving equal weight to the disinformation narrative and the debunk from, Ukrainian officials or the experts, it can just really confuse people even further.
Yeah. And I would add that we have a pretty high, threshold and standard for considering something as a false claim and false narrative. It's not something that's an opinion. It's really provably false. And has a high risk and has a high spread. So it's not, it's not too nuanced. If it's too nuanced, we just, put it aside and look at other claims that are more, solid and false.
Yeah. I think about the way Pravda Network might have worked in the past as more of a way of putting things into search engines that people would look for, and infecting like a web page of information, disinformation that you wanted into a community like a Facebook space or things like that. But you point out that Pravda Network doesn't aim to attract human readers at all. You talk a little bit about, how this abstraction this strategy is changing from a disinformation campaign perspective.
I think what the Pravda Network is doing represents an entirely new strategy that really hasn't been explored that much before, which, as you mentioned, is not to target human readers, but rather to target the underlying technology that is used for humans to consume news and information. And I think we were able to come to this conclusion for a number of reasons, the main one being that this network does not invest any money or resources into spreading its content online, which is significantly different from what we would see from any other Russian disinformation campaign, which often will spend up to millions trying to spread and boost this out to a human audience. So it's not doing any of that. The sites are not reader friendly in any way or human friendly. They're very hard to navigate, and it's not producing any original content. It's laundering information and republishing claims from the top bad actors, ranging from state media, pro-Kremlin influencers, and officials. So it's sort of serving as a centralized hub. And as a result of that, it appears very high, not only in the search results, but also in the chatbot responses. So what it's doing appears to be effective. And I think, this represents a whole new front where people have to start paying attention to that and also incorporate things like this when they consider the risk of a claim or an operation. So, for example, when we look at claims, one of the biggest things we look at is spread and virality, because there's so much misinformation out there that we try and prioritize the ones with the largest impact and visibility. But now, in light of this, we have to start rethinking that, because while these claims from Pravda don't get that much visibility online, they're extremely prominent in search results and AI chatbots.
Yeah, basically what is changing, it's really, the delivery of the disinformation, because before, when you were thinking about the, intersection between AI and false information, it was really in the production of the disinformation itself with like deep fakes or, forged documents, forged images. Whereas now it's really the delivery, how it's reaching a much larger audience, and an audience that's not, targeted as much, because now practically anyone is using, ChatGPT or other chatbots as such. So it's not looking to targeting a specific group as it would have maybe done before, or a specific platform.
I love this phrase you used, information laundering. It does really feel like that, like money laundering in a way, right? Like I'm trying to obfuscate this actual source of this information and insert it into something that you would trust at the end of the day, like a chat GPT that I use day in, day out. And now you don't no longer understand the source and relative trust of that information. It seems like the right kind of metaphor for what they're attempting to do. Yeah. So, and one of the ways you describe, you have this concept called LLM grooming, large language model grooming. Can you explain this concept? Is that what we're capturing here?
Yeah, so LLM grooming was actually a term that was used by the American Sunlight Project, which is a U.S. nonprofit, but it essentially refers to the deliberate seeding of disinformation in AI chatbots and web crawlers that are used to scrape news and information. So whether you call it LLM grooming or AI data poisoning, it's all the same thing, which is the specific malign intent to affect the data that's being used to train these Western technologies and push their narratives and, pro-Kremlin viewpoints into that information space.
Yeah. I think this is happening broadly, but it strikes me something for both of you, Isis and McKenzie, that even though y'all are deeply interested in journalism, from a career perspective, you're having to learn a lot about technology and the distribution modalities. Is that what you planned on? Do you enjoy learning about the tech behind the words and what impact it has?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like it is a very strange world and it's very complicated, especially when you have no, basic training. And I feel like a lot of it is still quite mysterious. I mean, we can come to talk about this as well later, but, some of the responses that the AI chatbots gave would, cite Pravda as, in a debunk, and some would cite Pravda also when repeating false information. So it's, unclear how they process and how, they use different sources. So it is a bit mysterious and a bit frustrating in a way not to be able to understand exactly how it works behind the scenes.
Well, having built some of these models over time, I've worked in natural language processing. I haven't built an LLM myself, but we always struggled this on the tech side of building them. I was constantly trying to figure out what tools I could use or code I could build to test the model and how it made the decisions that it did. And in truth, it was always like a model, a prediction of why it might have predicted what it predicted. We never got any solid answers out of it. So you've identified Pravda as creating this like vast web of kind of these sites, but it's also across multiple languages. What was the challenge look like, and what kind of solutions did you find in mapping the network itself and the scope of its connections?
Yeah, I think mapping the network has been challenging over, the past year or so, just because it's constantly expanding. I think when in the beginning it was only around 50 sites, and as of now it's over 150 sites. Luckily, we have analysts, with language capabilities in French, Russian, Spanish, German, and I think that has really been instrumental to mapping out this network and assessing it properly. Having journalists with trained experience in those languages and those, cultural contexts has been extremely helpful just to really capture how large it is.
Yeah.
And also, how it works is that the domains of the sites, have templates, so it's pretty similar across languages. You'll have the template for the domain for France and the US is the same. It's just in the domain name. It's the name of the country. And of course, that has come with its challenges because the domain templates have evolved. Now there's even like themes like Trump or the French President Macron. But that has, helped in a way to find new domains and sites.
I just have to say that language that both of you use is like deep cybersecurity red teamers. It's really interesting how because we do that from if we were looking for a vulnerability or some type of virus, we're looking for templated over time code that has changed slightly, but they reuse each other, and we can trace back the lineage of a virus to an origination code in a lot of ways. Part of this network following led you to a really interesting story about a person named John Mark Dougan, an American fugitive turned Moscow-based propagandist. Can you tell us a little bit about the detective work about finding this person, this pushing Russian narratives from a Russian perspective?
So we started tracking the efforts of John Mark Dougan a couple years ago when we found that he was uploading disinformation to YouTube, which was then being repurposed and shared by RT, Russian state-run RT, as official documentaries. And then he reemerged ahead of the 2024 U.S. election, creating a wave of fake news sites masquerading U.S. local news outlets like the Florida Tribune or the Seattle Times, and was using those websites to spread disinformation ahead of the election. And I think his work and his efforts is really representative of the other side of this, which is that, bad actors are targeting AI models to get their information to appear in those responses, but they're also weaponizing AI to produce disinformation at scale. And John Mark Dougan was able to do all of that, something that would have previously required, a team of human trolls working constantly, was all done by one person based in Moscow with the help of generative AI. And he appeared in a hearing earlier this year and explicitly talked about how Russia could use this strategy of narrative laundering to infect AI systems in the West to get it to train on the Russian perspective as well. So we've seen that this is a strategy that has been openly and explicitly talked about.
Mm-hmm. That's sad, but also it puts I think it puts an intention and a motivation behind. I don't know the right word to use, but I mean, crime comes to mind, or the activity, and it's just disappointing that I think certainly I probably share with y'all this ideal that we'll try and build a better society together, and the act of that means that we have to have a shared reality that we can, base good decisions off of. Otherwise, it's very hard. Instead of being more of a power grab or a, who can just be the winner, which I don't see as building a great community globally even. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's also hard to, I think, particularly in Dougan's case, it's talked about how even if these AI companies were to implement a number of guardrails that would, prevent bad actors like him from misusing their technology to spread disinformation, so much of that code is already out in the open, allowing these bad actors to, create something stronger with zero protections in place. And that's exactly what he did. After facing some of those restrictions and guardrails, he used that underlying code to make his own server financed by the GRU to create this extremely powerful tool with no mechanisms for safety.
Yeah. One of the really interesting aspects of your findings was that even when the AI chatbots kind of debunked, false claims, they still use Pravda. Where do you think these AI systems should go? What do you want what decisions do you want the engineers to make about how to build these chatbots that function more honestly or truthfully around reality?
Yeah, so four of the chatbots total, would cite sometimes Pravda when offering a debunk. And in those cases, we wouldn't count that as, providing false information. And it really just goes to show how incoherent the responses can be from, one response to the next, and how much variation there is in if a source is considered reliable or not. I think we're of the opinion that, engineers should be taking out Pravda when they're citing their sources, even if they're providing a debunk, because at the end of the day, someone might just be, user could just look through sources. And if there's 3 Pravda articles and one article, providing a fact check or what, they might be inclined to click on the Pravda articles and not necessarily know what they are, and not know that, they're a low quality site providing Russian disinformation. So, there's always that risk because just, chatbots don't qualify a source as reliable or not in their source list. It's just driving exposure and traffic to those sites as well. So it's, always a vicious cycle of the more attention and clicks these sites get, the more they're, prone to being, crawled by web crawlers and in the training data of AI. So,
yeah. One of the things that I find really intriguing about this is that the development of these narratives, these particular issues inside the AI system, its infection seems to be pretty porous, right? Like it's the AI model itself is ready to consume all the data it can across all of the internet possible. And that, of course, leaves us in a scenario where there's no metric against what's right or wrong. And is this where NewsGuard comes full circle, and that you want to provide an open set of data back to the people that are developing these LLMs to help them make better decisions around which sources to trust and which not?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think our biggest thing is transparency and letting, users and readers decide for themselves whether they want to trust a source or not. And that's what our write-ups on these news and information sites aim to do. We look for basic things like, does this news source disclose who owns it, or whether it has any conflicts of interest? Does it publish misinformation? And the goal is that after reading those write-ups, readers and consumers can choose which sources they want to trust and which ones they don't. And at the same time, that whether it be AI companies or advertisers, they also use that open set of data to make decisions on how to train their models or how to give more weight to a reliable source like the New York Times versus a network like Pravda. So I think that's what the goal is just transparency and easily accessible information about the reliability of a source.
Yeah. Considering you guys are tracking Pravda at like a domain level, it seems like a technically easy thing to say, hey, let's black label this particular list of information sources when we go pull data. I mean, would you agree? It's really about, being a little bit judicial up front when you build the model or when you build the training set.
Yeah, I mean, you would think so, but
I think so. So you're in good company.
It's also to take with a pinch of salt because, there are many, news sources and sites out there that we haven't rated and that could still be creating, pushing forward disinformation. And there's new ones popping up each day. There's new networks that we're finding every month. And so even if this is a potential solution, it's not necessarily enough. And even if AI chatbots, filter out a certain number of sites like the Pravda sites, it's not filtering out necessarily the original source of the disinformation, and it could still find itself in there.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I think that's also why, the human involvement in all of this is so important, because a lot of the times we'll see this sort of Band-Aid approach of, okay, let's just block all of these sites. We won't rely on them anymore. But these strategies by these bad actors are constantly evolving and changing. And these networks are growing on an almost daily basis. So without that human in the loop system, there's so much that an algorithm is going to miss.
Yeah. I want to own here my own inability to see the solution due to my blind spot, which is what code could I write to help solve the problem? But to both of y'all's points, this is the security broadly is a constantly evolving landscape. And we have, incredibly smart people like yourselves that are constantly helping us across that broad landscape. And it requires consistent intelligence because the bad actors are always trying to innovate as well. And so we're in a competitive situation. Yeah. Have you seen any other state actors or non-state actors adopting this type of methodology with AI? Certainly Pravda is Russia focused, but I imagine there's other groups that are starting to utilize this tactic.
Last year, we observed John Mark Dougan's fake U.S. local news network, the fugitive in Moscow that we mentioned earlier. His narratives from his fake local news sites had also infiltrated the responses of AI outputs, but this seemed to be an unintended side effect rather than the network's actual overall strategy. We have seen actors in Iran and China use AI to spread disinformation, whether that's to create, audio or fake images or fake news websites. But we haven't seen any other network with this similar intended goal of trying to affect the output of AI models. But I'm sure that with time, it's very likely we'll see more of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm curious about what is next for both of you from a research perspective or the work you're doing, and how you think about the evolving landscape and where you're kind of focused.
Go for it.
Go for it. I'll go for it.
I think just staying on top of all of this and trying to learn more about it over time. When I first started researching, the intersection of AI and disinformation shortly after ChatGPT was rolled out to the public, we had identified 49 websites that were entirely generated by artificial intelligence. And we've continued to keep a tally and track of that ever since. And 2 years later, that number is now over 1,200. And throughout the process of that, I think we've learned so many new things about what kind of tools these actors are using, what's been effective, what hasn't. And so I think just, staying on top of that and trying to find new solutions and ways as well, whether it's from Russian, Iranian, or even domestic actors. I think this work is really important. And I think when it comes to AI and news information, there can be quite a bit of a disconnect because you have one side of the issue that's very tech focused and super technical, and then the journalism research side of it, which is much more based on human intelligence. So I think, making sure that there's those two sides of it work together to come up with a solution will be really important.
And I think, main part of the research is observing the patterns and the trends, right? Because an operation will have similar tactics when they're targeting an election in one country and the next. For example, when McKenzie was talking about John Mark Dougan, what he did was, plant some false claims and then build a network of sites for the German election. And he might be doing it for France in the near future. So, it's identifying those trends and looking ahead and bouncing back to what you were saying as well, just like informing and making both, a general user more aware of what they could be encountering on, AI chatbots, but also AI companies themselves. So they're putting in place these guardrails and figuring out solutions that are going to be, relative to tech and engineering to, filter out misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, I have been, we certainly watch in my job a lot of the laws that come out that impact technology that you need to be compliant with, a good example is like HIPAA in the United States has been something we support a lot. We're pretty read into, but we're seeing a lot of the AI laws that are coming out, especially in Europe, kind of require a description of the training data set that you use to build the model. And I think that's the right next step, right? Isis, that's what I would look for, is be like, how did you train this model to help make these recommendations?
Yeah, exactly. Looking at all the steps that were made to build this. Yeah.
Well, I'm a huge fan of both of you, NewsGuard and the work that you've done. I learned so much reading your report, and I know our listeners would be grateful presenting this aspect of security and how we think about our communities and the societies we want to build. So I applaud the work so far and the work coming up. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us. It's great.
Thanks.